Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The body was discovered just after dawn, when the fog still clung to the low ground along the river, and the industrial park remained half asleep. A sanitation worker noticed the shape first, slumped behind a chain-link fence near a storm drain. From a distance it looked like discarded clothing, a heap of fabric pressed into the mud. Up close, it resolved into a woman lying on her side, one arm folded beneath her, the other stretched outward as if she had reached for balance and failed. Her name, as it would later be recorded, was Lily Moore. She was 28 years old. The address on her identification placed her in a decaying apartment complex several miles away, a place where residents came and went without ceremony and where names rarely lingered. To the first responders, she was immediately identifiable as someone who lived on the margins. Her clothes were mismatched and worn. Her purse was missing. There were no visible signs of a struggle in the immediate area, only the impression of her body in the damp earth. The location was unremarkable by design. The industrial park sat between a decommissioned rail spur and the river, a corridor of warehouses, trucking depots, and empty lots that served little purpose after business hours. At night, it became a thoroughfare for people who preferred not to be seen. Lily had been known to work along that stretch, meeting clients in cars or slipping into the shadows between buildings. She was not alone in that practice, but she was one of the few whose name appeared with any regularity in local police reports, usually for minor offenses or welfare checks. The medical examiner would later determine that she had been dead for several hours before she was found. The cause of death was not immediately obvious. There were no gunshot wounds, no knife injuries, no blood pooled beneath her. Her face showed faint bruising along the jaw and neck, subtle enough to be missed in poor light. Her hands were dirty, her fingernails broken. It suggested movement before death, though whether it was struggle or flight remained unclear. News of the discovery spread quickly through the department, though it did not reach the wider public until much later. At first glance, the case seemed straightforward, even routine. A sex worker found dead in an isolated area invited assumptions, many of them unspoken but firmly held. Overdose was considered, then quietly set aside when toxicology came back clean. Exposure was unlikely given the mild night. Assault was possible, but there were no obvious injuries to support it. Strangulation became the working theory, though the marks were faint and inconsistent. Detectives began with Lily's known associates. Her phone, recovered later that morning in a drainage ditch several blocks away, provided a partial record of recent contacts. Many of the numbers were untraceable, prepaid phones that led nowhere. Others belonged to people who denied knowing her beyond a casual encounter, a ride offered, a conversation forgotten. Each interview ended the same way, with shrugs and vague recollections that dissolved under scrutiny. Her apartment told a similar story. It was sparsely furnished, the walls bare, the refrigerator nearly empty. A calendar hung in the kitchen, with several dates circled, though no notes explained their significance. On the counter sat a stack of envelopes addressed to different names, all variations of Lily's own. None were opened. In the bedroom, detectives found a notebook tucked beneath the mattress. It contained lists of names and times, some crossed out, others marked with small symbols that meant nothing at first glance. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone else had been there recently. Whatever had happened to Lily had occurred elsewhere, and her body had been brought to the industrial park after the fact. Tire impressions near the fence suggested a vehicle had stopped briefly, then left. The prints were too degraded to identify, flattened by morning traffic and the damp ground. As the investigation widened, patterns began to emerge that did not fit the initial assumptions. Lily's phone records showed frequent contact with a single number over the past several weeks, far more consistent than any of the others. The number was registered to a shell account, but the timing of the calls was notable. They often occurred during regular business hours, not late at night. The duration was brief, rarely more than a minute. Financial records added another layer. Lily's bank account, usually overdrawn, showed several deposits in the months leading up to her death. The amounts were modest but regular, always just enough to keep the account afloat. The source was listed as cash deposits made at different branches across the city. It suggested planning and restraint, not desperation. Officers canvassed the area where Lily had last been seen alive. A security camera at a nearby warehouse captured footage of a woman matching her description entering a car around midnight. The vehicle was a dark sedan, its license plate obscured by glare. The driver's face was not visible. The car did not appear again on any nearby cameras. As the days passed, the case resisted easy categorization. There were no immediate suspects, no clear motive. Yet the more detectives learned about Lily's final weeks, the less her death resembled the random violence it had first appeared to be. She had been careful, more so than others in her position. She kept records. She maintained routines. She had recently begun asking questions, according to one acquaintance, about work that did not involve the street at all. The notebook from her apartment was sent for analysis. The symbols, when compared against her phone records and calendar, began to align. Times matched up. Names corresponded to numbers. It hinted at a structure beneath her daily life, something organized and deliberate. Whatever Lily had been involved in, it extended beyond survival and into territory that required discretion. By the end of the first week, the investigation had shifted in tone. What began as a probable homicide with limited scope now suggested a deeper network, one that Lily had touched only briefly before it turned against her. The industrial park, the fog, the anonymity of the place, all felt less like coincidence and more like design. And somewhere within the city, the person or people responsible continued their routines, confident that the death of one woman would pass unnoticed, misfiled under assumptions that no one would bother to challenge. The second week of the investigation brought movement, though not the kind that offered clarity. It brought contradiction, fragments that did not align cleanly, and a growing sense that Lily Moore had been navigating a space deliberately hidden from view. The notebook became the center of attention. At first, it appeared mundane, a ledger of clients and appointments, the kind of record many women in Lily's position kept for safety and scheduling. But the structure was too precise. Names appeared in repeating sequences. Times were clustered in narrow windows. Certain entries were marked with a small square drawn beside them, always in the same careful hand. Those entries corresponded to the circled dates on the kitchen calendar. When detectives mapped them together, they formed a pattern of weekly meetings that had nothing to do with street work. Investigators revisited Lily's phone records with that pattern in mind. The frequently contacted number, the one registered to a shell account, aligned exactly with the marked entries. Calls would come shortly before the scheduled times, then again shortly after. The conversations were short, but consistent. Whoever was on the other end was not negotiating services. They were confirming compliance. Detectives began to suspect that Lily had been functioning as more than an independent sex worker. There were signs of coordination, oversight, and boundaries she did not control, yet none of the traditional indicators of a pimp or trafficker were present. No threats reported, no visible violence in her recent history, no sudden changes in her living situation. Instead, there was an impression of containment, of someone being managed quietly. They expanded the scope to include other women known to work in the same corridor. Several were located and interviewed over the following days. Most were guarded, some openly hostile. A few were frightened enough to say very little at all, but two mentioned Lily unprompted. They described her as cautious, increasingly withdrawn in the weeks before her death. She had stopped sharing information about clients. She had declined offers to work together. One woman recalled Lily mentioning a different kind of arrangement, something safer, indoors, involving people who did not want attention. None of them knew where these meetings took place. Lily had been careful not to say. The financial deposits continued to bother detectives. The locations of the bank branches were plotted on a map. They formed a rough loop around the city. No two deposits made at the same branch twice in a row. The timing was consistent, mid-morning, on weekdays. It suggested someone with a predictable schedule, someone who moved through the city with purpose and familiarity. Surveillance footage from the bank branches was requested, though most cameras had already overwritten the relevant dates. One branch, however, retained footage from a deposit made 3 weeks before Lily's death. The image was grainy, but usable. It showed a man in his 40s, clean-cut, dressed in business casual clothing. He wore no hat, no sunglasses. He did not appear rushed or nervous. He approached the teller, completed the transaction, and left. His face was visible long enough to be memorable. Facial recognition produced several possible matches, all inconclusive. The man did not appear in any criminal database. He was not someone who lived in the neighborhoods Lily frequented. That absence became its own form of presence. Attention returned to the night of Lily's death. The warehouse camera footage was enhanced, frame by frame. The sedan's shape suggested a newer model, likely leased or rented. Traffic cameras along nearby arterial roads were reviewed, looking for a matching silhouette around the same time. After days of sifting through footage, analysts identified a vehicle that appeared repeatedly within a narrow window. It moved through the industrial corridor, then merged onto the highway heading north. The license plate was partially visible in one frame, just enough to narrow it down to a handful of possibilities. All were registered to rental agencies. Records from those agencies showed that one car matching the description had been rented that week by a consulting firm based downtown. The firm specialized in risk management and corporate compliance. On paper, it had no reason to intersect with Lily Moore's life. Detectives paid a visit. The firm occupied 2 floors of a glass office building overlooking the river. The space was quiet, orderly, and intentionally bland. Employees spoke in measured tones. Schedules were tight. Records were immaculate. When asked about the rental car, an administrator confirmed it had been assigned to a mid-level analyst for a series of site visits. The analyst, a man whose age and appearance matched the figure from the bank footage, was currently out of town. There was nothing overtly suspicious about the firm. No criminal history. No regulatory issues. Yet the alignment was too precise to ignore. The deposits, the calls, the vehicle, the controlled regularity of it all. Investigators sought a warrant for Lily's phone data beyond call logs. Location history revealed that she had traveled to a specific address multiple times in the past month, always during daylight hours. The address led to a nondescript office park on the outskirts of the city, not far from the consulting firm's building, but owned by a different holding company. Inside that office park, one suite stood out for its lack of visible signage. Utilities were active. Parking was minimal. There were no online listings for a business operating there. Surveillance over several days showed sporadic activity. People arrived alone, stayed briefly, then left. No one lingered. When detectives entered the space with a warrant, they found it stripped nearly bare. No computers, no paperwork, no personal effects. Only a few pieces of furniture remained, bolted to the floor. In a back room, faint impressions on the carpet suggested that equipment had been removed recently. The walls bore marks where something had once been mounted, then taken down with care. It was not abandonment, It was closure. As the pieces accumulated, a new understanding took shape. Lily Moore had been part of something transactional but not sexual, something that required her presence, her anonymity, and her ability to move unnoticed. Whatever role she played, it had ended abruptly. Her death was not impulsive, it was corrective. By the time the analyst returned to the city, detectives were waiting. He cooperated fully, answering questions with practiced ease. He acknowledged renting the car. He explained the deposits as reimbursements handled on behalf of a client. He denied knowing Lily Moore. His account was internally consistent, supported by documentation that appeared legitimate. But there were gaps, small ones, carefully placed. And in those gaps, investigators sensed intent. The case was no longer about a woman found dead behind a fence. It was about an operation that had intersected briefly with someone expendable, someone whose death could be dismissed as inevitable. The more detectives pushed, the more resistance they encountered, not in the form of threats or obstruction, but in layers of professionalism designed to absorb scrutiny. By the end of the second week, the investigation had reached a threshold. They could see the outline of something substantial, but not its center. Lily Moore had known it, touched it, and paid for that contact with her life. Whatever lay behind her death was still intact, still functioning, and increasingly aware that it was being observed. Pressure changed the investigation in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Access slowed. Requests that would normally move through routine channels were delayed by procedural questions and jurisdictional uncertainty. It was not overt obstruction. It was institutional drag, applied with enough subtlety to feel coincidental. The consulting firm retained legal counsel. Records that had once been accessible now required additional approvals. Each step forward demanded twice the effort. Detectives adapted by narrowing their focus. If the operation behind Lily Moore's death was insulated by layers of legitimacy, then the weak points would be human rather than structural. They returned to Lily herself, reconstructing her final months with greater precision. Her movements were charted day by day. Surveillance footage from convenience stores, transit stops, and parking garages filled in gaps where digital records ended. A timeline emerged that showed her transitioning away from street work and into a pattern of scheduled appearances that were tightly controlled. Those appearances were brief. She arrived alone and left alone. There were no signs of coercion in the footage. Her posture was steady, her pace was unhurried. Whatever she was doing, she had accepted it as part of her routine. Investigators found one deviation. 3 days before her death, Lily broke pattern. Instead of returning home after one of the daytime meetings, she traveled across town to a public library. She stayed for nearly 2 hours. Inside, security cameras captured her seated at a computer terminal, reviewing documents that required focused attention. The browsing history, recovered later, showed searches related to corporate structures, shell companies, and liability law. It was not casual curiosity, it was targeted. From the library, Lily went to a coffee shop several blocks away. She sat alone, wrote in her notebook, then tore out several pages and placed them in her bag. Those pages were never recovered. That evening, her phone made a call to the Shell number, outside the usual schedule. The call lasted longer than any previous contact. Location data placed her near the river, not far from the industrial park. After that, the phone went dark. The analyst remained a problem. He continued to cooperate while revealing nothing of consequence. His work history was clean. His finances showed no irregularities beyond what had already been identified. He had no apparent connection to Lily, yet his movements overlapped with hers, too often to dismiss. When confronted with the library visit, he expressed polite surprise and no recognition. Detectives pursued another angle. The office suite on the outskirts of the city had been leased through a holding company with minimal public presence. Tracing its ownership required peeling back multiple layers of incorporation. Eventually, it led to a parent entity registered out of state, then to a trust managed by a private fiduciary firm. The structure was legal, common even, but expensive to maintain. It existed for a reason. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A financial crimes analyst reviewing unrelated data noticed a series of transactions that mirrored Lily's deposits. They appeared in accounts belonging to several other women across different cities. The amounts were similar. The timing was consistent. Each account belonged to someone with limited income and minimal credit history. Each woman had been paid just enough to remain solvent, never enough to draw attention. One of those women had filed a missing persons report in another state 6 months earlier. Her body had never been found. At the time, her disappearance had been classified as voluntary. Now the pattern suggested otherwise. The scope expanded rapidly. What had seemed local was revealed to be distributed. The women were not connected to one another. They lived in different regions. They worked in different environments. What they shared was invisibility and reliability. They were people who could move through spaces without leaving impressions. Investigators theorized that the operation used these women as controlled intermediaries. They entered environments where scrutiny was minimal, performed tasks that required presence but not authority, and left without attracting notice. What those tasks were remained unclear. There were no records of theft or sabotage, no direct financial crimes tied to their movements. The answer lay in timing. Cross-referencing the women's appearances with corporate events revealed a subtle alignment. Board meetings, internal audits, regulatory inspections, moments when information changed hands quietly. The women were present in the same buildings, sometimes on the same floors, during critical windows. They were not stealing data. They were observing behavior. They were confirming compliance. The consulting firm specialized in risk management. Their clients included corporations navigating sensitive transitions. The women provided deniability. If something went wrong, the fault could be externalized. If something went right, the mechanism remained invisible. Lily had learned enough to become dangerous. Her library searches suggested she was beginning to understand the structure she was part of. Her notebook entries showed growing complexity, symbols evolving into shorthand that tracked more than time and place. She had started to document the operation from the inside. That knowledge changed her value. It also changed her risk. The night she died, Lily had met with someone outside the established framework. Investigators identified a brief encounter captured on a traffic camera, a man approaching her car, leaning in, then stepping back. He was never identified, but his presence coincided with the unscheduled call. Lily had tried to negotiate or disclose or escape. The specifics remained out of reach, but the consequence was clear. The consulting firm's legal insulation held. There was no direct evidence tying them to her death. The analyst could not be placed at the scene conclusively. The operation, if that was what it was designed to withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny. Yet pressure accumulated. Regulators took interest in the firm's practices. Clients began to withdraw quietly. The trust that underpinned the office suite dissolved. The space remained empty. Lily Moore's case reached a point of near resolution, without closure. The detectives had identified the shape of the machinery, but not the hand that stopped it. They understood why she died, even if they could not prove how. Her death was not a message sent outward. It was a correction applied inward. As the investigation entered its final phase, one truth became unavoidable. Lily had not been a victim of chance or circumstance. She had been part of a system that depended on her invisibility until the moment she saw herself clearly. The resolution did not arrive as a confession or an arrest. It arrived as convergence. What finally anchored the case was not Lily Moore's death itself, but the quiet unraveling that followed it. Systems designed to avoid attention tend to fail when they must correct their own mistakes. In trying to contain what Lily had learned, the operation created traceable urgency, and urgency left marks. The unscheduled call on the night of her death became the focal point. Analysts reconstructed the routing data beyond the shell account. The call had been forwarded through an internal relay used by the consulting firm for time-sensitive communications. It was meant to mask location, not identity. The forwarding system logged access internally, a redundancy intended for auditing that no one expected law enforcement to reach. The access came from one terminal, one user credential. It belonged to the analyst. His movements that night were re-examined with new authority. Traffic cameras previously dismissed as inconclusive were reviewed in sequence rather than isolation. The dark sedan did not disappear after leaving the industrial corridor. It looped back toward the river, paused briefly near a public overlook, then continued north. Cell tower pings placed the analyst's personal phone offline during that window, then reconnected miles away. Forensics from Lily's body, reinterpreted in light of the timeline, supported a narrow conclusion. The bruising on her neck was consistent with restraint, applied briefly and precisely. There was no prolonged struggle. She had not been killed in a rage or in panic. She had been silenced efficiently. The motive was containment. Investigators reconstructed Lily's role fully at last. She had been placed, not trafficked or coerced, but recruited through incremental dependency. She was paid to attend spaces where her presence would not register. She was instructed to observe, not record. Her value lay in her memory and her disposability. She confirmed whether environments matched expectations, whether procedures were followed, whether people behaved as they claimed to. She was human verification, deniable and invisible. When she began documenting the structure around her, she crossed the boundary that protected her. Her library research had not gone unnoticed. The consulting firm tracked deviations aggressively. The analyst had been assigned to resolve the issue. He did not intend to kill her. That became clear through internal correspondence recovered later. He intended to warn her, to remind her of the limits of her role. The meeting by the river was meant to be corrective, not terminal. But Lily did not comply. She refused to surrender what she had written. She threatened to expose the operation, not publicly but legally. She understood enough to be credible. The analyst made a decision that was not sanctioned, but was predictable within the system he served. He restrained her to recover the pages she carried. The pressure he applied was brief and fatal. When he realized what he had done, he reverted to protocol. He staged the scene to invite assumption. He left her where she would be found and miscategorized. The consulting firm did not order her death. It absorbed it. When confronted with the reconstructed timeline and internal logs, the analyst did not contest the facts. He accepted responsibility without explanation. He did not implicate the firm directly, and the evidence did not require him to. His actions fell just outside institutional liability, precisely where the system was designed to shed risk. He was charged with homicide. The case against him was technical, meticulous, and narrow. It did not address the broader operation, only the act that ended Lily Moore's life. The firm settled quietly with regulators months later, restructuring under a different name. The trust dissolved. The office suite remained empty. The other women connected to the pattern were located where possible. Some were alive, still unaware of the full scope of what they had been part of. Others were not found. Their cases were reopened, though few yielded answers. Lily Moore's notebook, reconstructed from partial recovery and analysis, became evidence rather than testimony. It proved enough to explain her death, but not enough to dismantle what surrounded it. The case closed without ceremony. There were no public statements, no press conferences. Lily's name appeared briefly in court documents, then receded again. She'd been invisible in life by design. In death, she became visible only long enough to expose the shape of the system that consumed her, before that system adapted and moved on. Now, let's get into the next story. The accident happened on a stretch of road that discouraged memory. State Route 117 cut through the hills outside Calder Ridge in a series of long, patient curves, bordered by scrub oak and limestone outcrops that all looked the same at speed. There were no homes nearby, no businesses, no reason to stop. At night, the road emptied completely, and even during the day, traffic passed through without leaving an impression. Shortly after 6 in the morning, a passing motorist noticed a pickup truck resting nose down in a ravine just beyond a guardrail. The vehicle had left the roadway at a shallow angle, broken through the metal barrier and come to rest against a cluster of trees 20 feet below. From above, it looked almost deliberate, as if carefully placed. The driver was still inside. His name was Daniel Hargreave. He was 46 years old and worked as a senior safety engineer for a regional construction contractor. He lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town and kept regular hours. He was not known for risk-taking. Friends described him as methodical, even cautious, the kind of person who double-checked locks and reviewed manuals before using new equipment. The initial assessment matched the scene. The road was damp from overnight fog. The curve was poorly lit. The guardrail showed signs of impact, consistent with a single vehicle collision. Daniel had not been wearing his seatbelt, which explained the injuries that killed him. There were no skid marks, but that was not unusual on that surface. The truck's airbags had deployed. The engine was cold by the time responders arrived. By mid-morning, the death was recorded as an accident. It might have stayed that way if not for the quiet inconsistencies that followed. The first came from the vehicle itself. When the truck was recovered, technicians noted that the headlights were off, despite the low visibility conditions. The switch was in the off position, not broken. Daniel was known to drive with his lights on habitually, even during the day. It was a small detail, easy to dismiss, but it lingered. Inside the cab, there was no sign of distraction. No phone in hand, no spilled coffee. His phone was found in the center console, powered off. His lunch was packed neatly in a cooler behind the seat, untouched. Everything suggested intent rather than interruption. The medical examiner's report introduced a second irregularity. Daniel had sustained a minor head injury prior to the crash, a blunt force impact that did not cause death, but could have disoriented him. It was impossible to say when it occurred. It could have been from the crash itself, or from something earlier. The report did not assign significance to it, but it prevented the case from closing cleanly. Attention turned briefly to Daniel's personal life. There was little to examine. No spouse, no children, no financial distress. His bank records were orderly. His email showed no conflict. He had no history of substance use. If anything, his life was defined by predictability. At work, his role involved compliance and inspection. He reviewed safety plans, audited job sites, and signed off on procedures that determined whether projects moved forward or stalled. It was not glamorous work, but it carried authority. When Daniel raised concerns, projects slowed. When he cleared them, costs stabilized. In the weeks before his death, Daniel had been assigned to a highway expansion project west of Calder Ridge, one that had already exceeded its budget and attracted scrutiny. His reports from that site were incomplete, a deviation from his usual thoroughness. He had requested additional documentation. He had delayed approval twice. The morning of the accident, he was driving in the opposite direction. Investigators retraced his route. There was no reason for him to be on Route 117 at that hour. It did not lead to his office. It did not connect to the project site. It was a longer, slower way out of town. When asked, his supervisor could not explain it. Daniel had not mentioned any appointments or site visits scheduled for that morning. A search of his home produced little at first. The house was clean, almost spare. But in a desk drawer, investigators found a folder that did not belong with the rest of his papers. Inside were photographs of construction sites taken from unusual angles, not panoramic shots, but close focus images of joints, supports, and anchor points. Some were annotated in Daniel's handwriting, others were not. There was also a flash drive. The drive contained inspection reports that did not match those submitted officially. They detailed deviations from approved plans, substitutions of lower-grade materials, and shortcuts taken to meet deadlines. The findings were serious enough to halt construction indefinitely. The files were dated within days of Daniel's death. None of them had been sent. By the end of the first week, the accident no longer sat comfortably with those reviewing it. The road conditions explained the crash only superficially. Daniel's presence there remained unexplained. The pre-existing injury suggested contact before impact, and the material he had gathered suggested pressure that extended beyond professional disagreement. What looked like a single vehicle accident on an empty road began to resemble something else, not a dramatic act of violence, but a controlled event shaped to look inevitable. And somewhere within the machinery of deadlines, contracts, and liability, a decision had likely been made that Daniel Hargreave was an obstacle that needed to be removed quietly. The ravine on Route 117 did not demand attention. That was its purpose. The investigation advanced reluctantly, as though constrained by the same forces that had shaped the accident itself. There was no public pressure, no grieving family demanding answers, no political urgency. Daniel Hargreave had lived carefully and privately, and his death generated little noise beyond procedural obligation. That silence allowed the inquiry to proceed slowly, methodically, and without interference at first. Investigators focused on Daniel's final 48 hours. His work computer showed that he had logged in late the evening before his death, an unusual deviation from his routine. He had accessed archived inspection records from prior projects, not only the highway expansion but several earlier developments tied to the same contractor. The pattern was clear. He was not reviewing performance. He was tracing precedent. Phone records added subtle texture. Daniel had received 3 calls that night from a blocked number. None were answered. A 4th call came just after midnight. That one he accepted. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. There was no voicemail, no follow-up. After that, his phone activity stopped until morning. Surveillance footage from a gas station near his home placed Daniel there at 5:14 a.m., earlier than usual. He purchased nothing beyond fuel. He did not use the restroom. He did not linger. The footage showed him standing beside the pump, looking at his phone, then scanning the street before returning to his truck. He appeared alert, not tired or distracted. From there, his route diverged. Instead of turning east toward his office, he headed north toward Route 117. The road itself was re-examined with forensic precision. Engineers analyzed the guardrail damage and concluded that the impact angle was shallow, inconsistent with loss of control at speed. The truck had not drifted or overcorrected. It had left the roadway gradually. There were no tire marks indicating panic braking. The accelerator position suggested steady pressure until the moment of impact. Inside the cab, investigators found faint traces of a second substance on the steering wheel and driver's side door. It was not toxic and not immediately identifiable. Lab analysis later confirmed it as residue from industrial solvent wipes, the kind used to clean equipment rather than hands. It suggested recent contact with a surface treated intentionally. The head injury became more important with context. The medical examiner revised the assessment, noting that the injury occurred prior to the crash and showed signs of localized impact rather than blunt trauma from collision. It was consistent with being struck by a firm object at close range, not severe enough to incapacitate, but enough to cause disorientation or delayed reaction. Attention returned to Daniel's workplace. The highway expansion project was behind schedule and under financial strain. Internal emails revealed tension between safety compliance and construction management. Daniel's requests for additional documentation had been met with polite resistance, then escalating frustration. One exchange, flagged by investigators, showed a project manager questioning whether Daniel understood the practical realities of the job. Daniel's reply was brief and formal, reiterating regulatory requirements without commentary. More revealing were emails he had drafted but not sent. They were addressed to state oversight agencies and outlined concerns about material substitutions and structural shortcuts. The tone was careful but unyielding. The attachments mirrored the files found on the flash drive. Someone else had known about those drafts. Daniel's access logs showed that his workstation had been opened remotely earlier that week from an administrative account. The access was brief, just long enough to view directory contents. It left no visible changes. The account belonged to an internal IT contractor, one who serviced multiple departments and maintained broad permissions. When interviewed, the contractor acknowledged accessing Daniel's system, but framed it as routine maintenance. There was no documentation to support that claim. The timing did not align with scheduled service windows. Investigators began to see the outline of preparation. Daniel had been flagged as a risk before he acted. His materials had been reviewed. His intent had been inferred. Whatever followed was not reactive. It was anticipatory. The night before his death, Daniel had removed the flash drive from his desk and taken it home. That detail mattered. It meant he had decided not to store his findings on company systems any longer. It suggested he no longer trusted internal channels. The blocked calls took on new significance. They were not harassment. They were attempts at contact that avoided traceability. The final call, the one he answered, likely altered his plans for the morning. Investigators hypothesized a meeting request, framed as clarification or resolution, a conversation that redirected him toward a road he would not otherwise take. Route 117 was isolated but accessible. There were several pull-offs along its length, used occasionally by maintenance crews. One of them, a gravel turnout less than half a mile before the crash site, showed tire impressions that did not match Daniel's truck. The impressions were recent and aligned with a vehicle that had parked briefly, then left. No cameras covered that stretch. The solvent residue suggested contact with a treated surface, possibly gloves or a cloth used to wipe something down. The absence of fingerprints beyond Daniel's inside the truck supported that interpretation. Someone had been careful. By the end of the second phase, investigators no longer debated whether the accident had been staged. The question had shifted to how much coordination it required and who had authorized it. The answer did not point to a single individual acting impulsively, but to a convergence of interests that benefited from Daniel Hargreaves' absence. He had not been killed to send a message. He had been removed to restore momentum. And whatever decision had been made along Route 117 that morning had been executed with the expectation that it would never be examined closely. As the investigation entered its third phase, it became clear that intent alone would not be enough. What mattered now was mechanism. Investigators needed to show not only that Daniel Hargreaves' death had been orchestrated, but that it had been engineered with specific knowledge of his habits, his work, and his psychology. They returned to the flash drive. A deeper forensic review revealed metadata anomalies. The files had been copied in batches rather than saved incrementally. That meant Daniel had consolidated his findings shortly before his death, likely anticipating that he would need them intact and portable. More telling was what was missing. There were references in his notes to supplemental photographs and field measurements that did not appear anywhere on the drive or in his home. Those materials had been removed. Investigators concluded that Daniel had brought them to the meeting he believed he was attending on the morning of the crash. Whatever occurred at the roadside turnout had involved an exchange, or an attempted one. The head injuries supported that theory. It was consistent with a sudden blow delivered during close contact, likely meant to incapacitate rather than kill. Daniel had then returned to his truck, disoriented but mobile. What followed was the critical interval. Data from the truck's onboard system showed that the engine had been turned off and restarted within a 5-minute window shortly before the crash. That detail had been overlooked initially because it did not register as abnormal. Now it suggested interruption. Someone had been inside or near the vehicle with Daniel. The headlights being switched off aligned with that timeline. Daniel had not forgotten to turn them on. They had been turned off deliberately. Investigators theorized that Daniel had been guided back onto the road under the pretense that the interaction was over. The expectation was likely that he would drive away shaken, possibly abandon his plans, possibly make a mistake later that could be dismissed as his own. Instead, his impaired state, combined with deliberate manipulation of the vehicle's conditions, led to immediate catastrophe. Attention turned to who could have arranged such a meeting. The IT contractor became central. His access to Daniel's system placed him in the informational flow. He knew what Daniel had documented. He knew the seriousness of it. Financial analysis showed that the contractor had received an unusual payment 2 weeks before the crash, routed through a subcontracting firm connected indirectly to the highway project. The amount was not life-changing, but it was significant enough to suggest compensation rather than error. Under scrutiny, the contractor's story began to fracture. His service logs were inconsistent. His location data placed him within driving distance of Route 117 on the morning of the crash, despite no documented work assignments in that area. He did not have a criminal record, but he did have a history of short-term contracts that ended abruptly, often following disputes or compliance issues. Investigators believed he had not acted alone. He was a facilitator, not an originator. The decision to neutralize Daniel likely occurred higher up, among those managing cost overruns and regulatory exposure. But that decision would never be written down or spoken plainly. It would have been framed as problem-solving, as risk mitigation, as ensuring continuity. The execution was delegated downward, diffused across roles so that no single participant held the full weight of intent. When confronted with the evidence, the contractor did not confess outright. He acknowledged meeting Daniel that morning. He framed it as an attempt to persuade him, to show him that escalation would have consequences. He admitted to striking Daniel once when the conversation escalated beyond control. He denied manipulating the vehicle. The physical evidence contradicted that denial. Traces of the same industrial solvent residue found in the truck were present on a pair of gloves recovered from the contractor's vehicle. The pattern of residue on the steering column suggested wiping, not incidental contact. Someone had cleaned selectively, removing prints while leaving surfaces functional. The work was careful but hurried. The contractor was arrested on charges related to assault and tampering. The case against him was solid but incomplete. He had facilitated the meeting and the initial violence, but the sequence that led to Daniel's death required a broader context. Investigators built that context patiently. They assembled timelines that showed who stood to benefit from Daniel's absence. Construction approvals resumed within days of his death. Material substitutions previously flagged were accepted without revision. Penalties were avoided. The project moved forward. No single executive could be tied directly to the act. That was by design. The system had insulated itself. What remained was the final act itself, the moment when Daniel's truck left the road. Experts concluded that Daniel had been conscious but impaired. His reaction time slowed. The headlights being off reduced his visual reference points. The curve approached gently. There was no sharp decision point, only gradual drift. The absence of braking indicated that he did not perceive immediate danger. The accident was not staged in the sense of theatrical destruction. It was staged as inevitability. By the end of Part 3, investigators understood the full arc. Daniel had uncovered information that threatened timelines and profit. He had been intercepted, disoriented, and returned to the road under conditions that ensured failure without obvious interference. Responsibility was distributed thinly enough to frustrate accountability. The final question was not how Daniel died. It was how much of the truth could be proven without exposing how routinely such decisions were made. The case resolved the way these cases often did, not with revelation, but with containment. Prosecutors focused on what could survive scrutiny. The IT contractor became the axis of accountability, not because he bore the greatest responsibility, but because his actions were the most tangible. He had accessed Daniel Hargreaves' system without authorization. He had contacted him from a blocked number. He had met him on Route 117. He had struck him. He had been present at the point where the sequence of events became irreversible. That was enough. The charge was not murder. It was involuntary manslaughter combined with evidence tampering. The theory was narrow and precise. The contractor had assaulted Daniel, causing impairment. He had interfered with the vehicle afterward, creating hazardous conditions. The crash, while not directly inflicted, was a foreseeable consequence of those actions. The broader structure was left untouched. During pre-trial discovery, internal communications from the construction firm were reviewed selectively. None referenced Daniel directly. None discussed removal or coercion. Instead, they spoke in abstractions: schedule pressures, regulatory risk, mitigation strategies. Consultants advised flexibility. Managers expressed confidence that obstacles would resolve. No one ordered a death. No one needed to. The contractor entered a plea agreement. In exchange for cooperation, he detailed the meeting and acknowledged wiping the truck's interior. He described being instructed to retrieve documents and discourage escalation. He insisted that the plan had been to frighten Daniel into silence, not to kill him. His testimony avoided naming individuals above him, and prosecutors did not press. His sentence reflected that balance. Significant, but finite. Daniel Hargreaves' findings never reached a courtroom. The flash drive was admitted as evidence, but its contents were deemed insufficient to reopen the construction approvals without corroboration from missing materials. Those materials were never recovered. The project continued. Inspections passed. The highway opened on schedule the following year. Officially, Daniel's death was amended. The ruling changed from accidental to criminally negligent. The language was careful. It acknowledged wrongdoing without assigning systemic blame. There was no public announcement. The update appeared quietly in court records. The house Daniel had lived in was sold within months. His belongings were dispersed. The folder of photographs and the flash drive were returned to his estate, such as it was. There was no one to preserve their meaning. Route 117 remained unchanged. The guardrail was repaired. The ravine was cleared of debris. Drivers passed the curve daily without slowing, unaware that the geometry of the road had once been used as a tool. In the end, the accident was exactly what it had been designed to be: plausible. absorbable, finite. Daniel Hargreave had believed that documentation would protect him, that precision would create safety. What he learned too late was that systems built on momentum do not confront obstacles directly. They redirect them until gravity does the rest. The truck left the road without resistance. The paperwork moved forward, and the machinery that required his absence never had to acknowledge him again. Now, let's get into the last story for tonight. The first light of morning moved slowly across the eastern edge of Silver Marsh, catching on the frost that still clung to the reeds and the wire fences along Route 11. The town sat low and wide, pressed between soybean fields and a shallow river that flooded every spring. In October, it smelled of wet soil, diesel fuel, and the faint sweetness of rotting leaves. Nothing in Silver Marsh suggested urgency. The streets were long and empty, the storefronts set back behind parking lots that stayed half full even on Saturdays. It was a place where time did not disappear so much as thin out. At 6:42 a.m., a white utility van rolled north through the outskirts of town, its tires humming steadily on the cold pavement. It did not slow at the blinking yellow light near the high school. It did not turn toward the grain elevators or the rail spur. It continued straight toward the narrow stretch of road that followed the river before bending east toward the county line. By 6:48, the van was no longer visible to any traffic camera within town limits. That morning, the sky stayed low and gray. School buses moved through their routes without incident. A delivery truck backed into the loading dock behind the pharmacy. At the regional medical clinic, nurses arrived in pairs, coffee cups steaming as they crossed the lot. Nothing appeared disrupted. Nothing suggested absence. The missing time announced itself later. At 8:19 a.m., a call came into the county dispatch center from a residence on Willow Bend Road, a cul-de-sac of newer homes built during the brief housing expansion 15 years earlier. The caller reported that a child had not arrived at school and was not responding to messages. The house was quiet. The front door was unlocked. A backpack sat on the kitchen floor beside the counter. Willow Bend Road curved gently, ending in a stand of cottonwoods that leaned toward the river. The houses were similar in size and color, with trimmed lawns and wide driveways that reflected a particular optimism about permanence. The house at number 14 stood midway down the street, its porch lights still on despite the late hour. The door had been closed but not latched. Inside, the air smelled faintly of toast and citrus cleaner. A breakfast plate rested in the sink. A glass of milk stood untouched on the counter, its surface skinning over. Shoes were lined neatly by the back door, except for one pair missing. The child was 9 years old. She had lived in Silver Marsh since she was 2. She walked to school every morning along the same route, past the park and the small footbridge over the drainage channel. It was a walk that took 12 minutes. Other children used it as well. Parents had argued about traffic and lighting, but no one had suggested it was dangerous. There had been no violent crime involving a child in the town for more than 2 decades. By 8:41 a.m., a patrol unit arrived at Willow Bend Road. By 8:55, a second. The officers moved through the house carefully, touching nothing they did not need to. They noted the unlocked door, the backpack, the absence of outerwear despite the cold. They stepped into the backyard, where the grass was flattened in places by recent rain. No fence showed signs of damage. No footprints stood out clearly in the mud. Neighbors were asked routine questions. Most had left for work early. One recalled seeing a vehicle idling briefly near the corner around 7, but could not describe it beyond its light color and boxy shape. Another remembered nothing unusual at all. The cul-de-sac returned quickly to its quiet state. now edged with yellow tape that fluttered lightly in the wind. At the elementary school, administrators confirmed that the child had not arrived. Attendance records showed no prior absences without notice. Teachers described her as punctual, organized, and shy. She had not expressed fear about walking to school. She had not mentioned anyone following her or speaking to her along the route. Her classmates noticed only that her desk was empty. By mid-morning, the case shifted from local concern to coordinated response. Detectives from the county sheriff's office arrived, followed by a representative from the state investigative unit. The tone remained controlled, procedural. No one used the word kidnapping aloud, but the absence of any sign that the child had left on her own began to narrow the possibilities. The walk from Willow Bend Road to the school was retraced step by step. Officers moved slowly along the sidewalk, scanning ditches and hedges, pausing at intersections. They checked the footbridge, where water moved sluggishly beneath a layer of fallen leaves. Nothing appeared disturbed. No fabric caught on the rail. No dropped item lay hidden in the grass. At the park, a groundskeeper reported arriving at 6:30 and seeing no one. A jogger recalled passing through around 7:15 and noticing a van parked briefly near the maintenance shed. The detail emerged hesitantly, as memory often does under scrutiny. The jogger could not say whether the van was occupied. He had not considered it unusual at the time. Traffic cameras were reviewed. The town had only 4, placed at major intersections. None covered Willow Bend Road directly. One camera captured a white utility van passing north at 6:42 a.m. The image was grainy, the license plate unreadable. The van did not appear again within town limits. Cell phone records would take time. Doorbell cameras along the route were limited. Some houses had them, others did not. Requests for footage went out. Responses came back unevenly. One camera showed a stretch of empty sidewalk. Another captured only the blur of headlights through trees. A third recorded nothing at all due to a drained battery. By early afternoon, the absence had become heavy. News vans lined the edge of the cul-de-sac. Reporters spoke in low voices, careful with language. Flyers were drafted, but not yet distributed. The child's name was released, along with a photograph taken at a school event the previous spring. In it, she smiled without showing her teeth, her hair pulled back tightly, her expression composed. Search teams assembled along the riverbanks and fields beyond the neighborhood. Volunteers moved in lines, eyes down, boots sinking into soft ground. Dogs were brought in, then redirected when the scent trail failed to establish. The river was shallow but wide, its banks uneven and cluttered with debris. Nothing surfaced. As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. The porch light at number 14 remained on. Inside, the house stayed exactly as it had been found, preserved in a state of interruption. Investigators returned to the kitchen, to the backpack, to the door that had not been locked. Each detail suggested routine broken cleanly in half. What unsettled them most was the lack of struggle. There were no marks on the doorframe, no overturned furniture, no sign that the child had been forced from the house. The timing suggested she had left willingly, or at least without immediate alarm. The route suggested familiarity. The van suggested planning. By nightfall, the working assumption hardened into something more concrete. Whatever had happened had occurred quickly, within a narrow window of time, in a town that had not been watching for it. The road by the river had already been driven and redriven, its shoulders illuminated by passing headlights. Beyond it lay miles of county land, intersected by highways that led in every direction. The search continued, steady and methodical, but the space where the child should have been remained empty. The morning had taken her quietly, and the day had failed to give her back. The second day began without ceremony. Silver Marsh woke under the same low sky, the same muted light. but the absence had settled into the town overnight. It moved through kitchens and offices, through the school halls where one desk remained empty, through the slow traffic along Route 11. People checked their phones more often. Parents drove children who had walked the week before. The river road, once ignored, now drew careful glances from every passing car. Investigators returned to the timeline. They compressed it, narrowed it, tested its edges. The window between 6:35 and 7:10 a.m. became the center of gravity. Within those 35 minutes, a child had left her home, traveled less than half a mile, and vanished without noise or witness. The utility van remained the most tangible element, a pale shape moving through a town that had not learned to look at itself closely. A canvass of similar vehicles began before noon. County records showed dozens registered within a 50-mile radius. Most belonged to contractors, farmers, municipal departments. Officers visited driveways and sheds, checked plates, noted dents and decals. The work was slow and uneven. Some owners were cooperative, others defensive. None produced an immediate match to the grainy camera image. At the same time, attention turned inward. The family's routines were examined in detail, not with suspicion, but with necessity. Investigators reconstructed the morning, minute by minute. The child had woken at her usual time. Breakfast had been prepared. The backpack suggested intention. There was no indication of distress inside the house. The unlocked door raised questions, but did not answer them. It could have been habit. It could have been interruption. Digital records began to arrive. The child did not have a phone. Her tablet, left charging on her desk, showed no activity that morning. The parents' phones placed them both away from the house by 6:30, following normal work patterns. No unfamiliar numbers appeared in recent call logs. Nothing suggested contact or planning. Along the school route, officers marked every potential point of concealment. A stand of hedges near the park. The maintenance shed where the jogger had noticed the van. A narrow service road that led behind a cluster of warehouses closer to the river bend. The areas were searched again, then again, each pass slower than the last. Dogs were reintroduced, their handlers adjusting strategy, but the scent remained fragmented, dissolving into the general smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. By the afternoon, a second camera image surfaced. A doorbell camera on a house 2 streets over had recorded a white vehicle passing at 6:51 a.m., partially obscured by trees. The angle suggested it had come from the river road, not toward it. The timestamp aligned with the narrowed window. The plate was still unreadable. The van appeared unmarked, its sides blank. Investigators debated whether the vehicle had been waiting or moving. A waiting van suggested surveillance, patience, familiarity with the child's schedule. A moving van suggested opportunity, coincidence, a driver who saw a child alone and acted quickly. Both possibilities carried different implications, and neither could be proven. The river became a renewed focus, not because evidence pointed there, but because it marked the town's edge, a natural boundary beyond which oversight thinned. Boats were brought in to check shallow inlets. Divers entered slower sections where debris collected. The water was cold and brown, visibility poor. Nothing was found beyond old tires and rusted metal. By evening, tips began to multiply. Some were earnest, others vague. A sighting near a gas station 30 miles east. A van seen parked behind a closed diner. A man who asked directions at a rest stop and seemed nervous. Each lead was logged, assessed, and often dismissed after hours of work. The volume itself became a challenge, pulling resources in too many directions at once. The investigative team adjusted. They formed a smaller unit dedicated solely to the van, separating it from the general search. They mapped its possible routes after leaving town, considering speed, traffic, and time. Within 20 minutes, The driver could have reached 3 highways. Within an hour, 5 counties. Within 2, the state line. Rest stops, toll cameras, and fuel stations were flagged. Requests went out to neighboring jurisdictions. The image of the van was circulated quietly at first, then more broadly when progress stalled. Still, no plate surfaced. No distinctive marking emerged. The van remained a shape without identity. Meanwhile, attention returned to the idea of familiarity. Investigators examined the child's recent weeks for any deviation. School records, extracurricular activities, medical appointments. The substitute teacher had been present 2 weeks earlier, but background checks showed nothing concerning. A repair crew had worked on the street the month before, but their records were clean and their vehicles different. A seasonal farmhand had rented a room nearby, but his schedule placed him elsewhere that morning. The absence of connection began to weigh on the case. Kidnappings that resolved often did so because of a mistake, a relationship, a trace. Here, there was only absence and a van that refused to become more specific. The efficiency of it unsettled even experienced investigators. It suggested planning without bravado, speed without chaos. On the 3rd morning, a breakthrough appeared to form, then dissolved. A utility van matching the general description was stopped 2 counties south. The driver was questioned, the vehicle searched. It had been purchased used 3 days before the disappearance, paid in cash. For several hours, the case narrowed sharply, then receipts placed the van elsewhere during the critical window. The driver was released, the space reopened, the family's house remained sealed. Fresh flowers gathered on the sidewalk outside the tape. Neighbors left notes, stuffed animals, folded drawings. The gestures accumulated quietly. Inside, investigators noticed small details they had overlooked before. A jacket missing from the hook. A lunch bag absent from the refrigerator. The child had dressed for the cold. She had expected to be outside for a while. This detail shifted the working theory subtly. If she had left prepared, she may have believed she was going somewhere specific. Not school, but somewhere that did not require urgency. The thought suggested deception rather than force, at least initially. It raised the possibility of a pretext, a reason offered quickly, something plausible to a child who trusted routines. Investigators compiled a list of anyone who might have known the child's schedule with precision. Teachers, neighbors, parents of classmates, delivery drivers, municipal workers. The list was long and unsatisfying. Most people knew the general rhythm of a school morning. Few knew exact minutes. As the week progressed, fatigue set in. Search grids expanded and then contracted. Resources were reassigned, then reassigned again. The town's initial unity began to thin, replaced by quiet anxiety. Doors locked more often. Windows stayed closed. The river road emptied. Late on the 5th day, a technician reviewing traffic data noticed an anomaly. A temporary road sensor, installed months earlier and largely ignored, had recorded vehicle counts and speeds along a stretch of county road east of the river. At 7:03 a.m. on the morning of the disappearance, it logged a vehicle slowing dramatically, then accelerating beyond the average flow. The classification suggested a light commercial vehicle. The data did not provide an image or a plate. It did, however, place a van on a specific road at a specific minute, moving in a way that suggested a stop had occurred. The road intersected with a narrow gravel pull-off used by anglers and maintenance crews. It was not on the school route. It was close enough to reach quickly. The team returned to the map. They drew a new line, then another. The shape of the morning shifted again, not toward resolution, but toward a clearer outline of how little time it had taken. Somewhere between the unlocked door and that gravel pull-off, the routine had broken. The space between those points remained stubbornly empty. The search continued, now with a sharper edge. But as night fell again over Silver Marsh, The child remained absent, and the van remained unidentified. The case had gained structure but not substance. It was becoming evident that whatever had happened had been designed to leave very little behind. By the second week, the investigation entered a quieter phase, one that appeared static from the outside but was marked by steady internal recalibration. The search grids stopped expanding. Resources were consolidated. Every assumption made during the first days was revisited, with less urgency and more precision. What had initially been treated as an emergency now had to withstand time. The gravel pull-off east of the river became a fixed point. It was unremarkable, a widening of the shoulder where trucks sometimes parked to check loads, or where fishermen left their vehicles before walking down to the water. The area had been searched early and quickly, when attention was spread thin. Now it was examined again, slowly. Soil samples were taken from the rutted ground. Vegetation was photographed and cataloged. A shallow depression near the tree line suggested a vehicle had idled there longer than necessary, its weight settling unevenly into damp earth. No trace of the child was found, but something else emerged. Tire impressions, faint and partially eroded, showed a tread pattern inconsistent with most local utility vans. It was subtle, the kind of detail easily lost to weather and foot traffic. Photographs were sent to a regional database. Analysts compared the pattern against manufacturer records. The result narrowed the field slightly, pointing toward a specific model produced in limited numbers during a short window. The van was becoming less abstract. At the same time, investigators shifted focus toward logistics rather than motive. They began asking not why someone would take a child, but how someone could do so and remain unseen. The efficiency suggested preparation. Preparation suggested familiarity with routes, timing, and response patterns. The offender had likely known when patrol cars were least active, which roads lacked cameras, how long it would take for concern to become action. That level of awareness did not require local routes, but it benefited from them. Attention returned to people whose work brought them through Silver Marsh regularly without anchoring them there. Delivery drivers, service technicians, maintenance contractors, seasonal laborers. Lists were refined, then refined again. One name, previously dismissed, resurfaced due to a scheduling inconsistency. A regional water systems contractor had been assigned to inspect rural pumping stations along the river corridor that week. His records showed a check-in near Silver Marsh on the morning of the disappearance, logged remotely rather than in person. The discrepancy was small. It might have been an error. It might have been nothing. Investigators pulled the contractor's vehicle information. He drove a white utility van purchased used 2 months earlier. The model aligned with the tread pattern. The van bore no company markings, as the contractor worked independently under rotating municipal contracts. His work required early hours and familiarity with service roads and pull-offs, similar to the one east of the river. Surveillance began quietly. The contractor lived alone in a town 70 miles away. His routines were observed over several days. He left early, returned late. He stopped at rest areas, hardware stores, supply depots. Nothing immediately incriminating surfaced. His van appeared clean, its interior orderly. A search warrant would require more. Investigators examined his work history. He had moved frequently over the past decade, following short-term contracts. No criminal record, no known complaints. References described him as reliable, reserved, difficult to know. He had worked in counties where similar disappearances had been reported, though none conclusively linked. The overlap was troubling, but circumstantial. Digital analysis offered another angle. License plate readers along highways outside Silver Marsh were rechecked with narrower parameters. One hit stood out. A plate registered to the contractor's van had been captured at a toll point 90 minutes after the disappearance, heading east. The timing fit. The direction fit. It did not prove presence at the gravel pull-off, but it placed the van on a plausible route away from town. The case tightened incrementally. A second warrant was obtained, this time for the contractor's storage unit. Inside, investigators found tools, spare parts, and personal effects stored with careful order. In a locked cabinet at the back, they discovered items that did not belong to the work. A child's jacket, consistent in size and color with the one missing from the house on Willow Bend Road. A lunch bag, clean but bearing faint traces of adhesive from a school label that had been removed. The discovery shifted the investigation decisively. The contractor was taken into custody without incident. His van was seized and transported to a secure facility. Forensic teams worked through it inch by inch. Beneath the cargo floor mat, they found fibers consistent with the child's clothing. In the drainage channel beneath the vehicle, traces of soil matched samples taken from the gravel pull-off. Still, the most critical question remained unanswered. Search efforts refocused based on the contractor's known routes and properties. A remote pumping station he serviced lay 20 miles east of Silver Marsh, accessible by a dirt road rarely used outside scheduled inspections. The structure was small, concrete, windowless. Inside, it housed machinery and a narrow maintenance room. There, investigators found evidence of recent occupation. Food wrappers, a blanket, a child's shoe. The site was searched thoroughly. The surrounding woods were combed in expanding circles. The ground showed signs of disturbance near a shallow ravine that fed into a culvert beneath the road. Excavation began carefully, methodically. As night approached, the search was halted and secured. The area was quiet except for the steady hum of generators and the low movement of water through the culvert. Investigators stood back, aware that the case was nearing its end, though the form that end would take was still uncertain. The contractor remained in custody. He offered no information. His history, once merely fragmented, now appeared patterned, a series of short stays and quiet departures that had never drawn attention on their own. By the time excavation resumed the next morning, the investigation had narrowed to a single place and a single individual. The efficiency that had once obscured the crime had now outlined it. What remained was to uncover what had been done in the time between the gravel pull-off and the toll road east, a span measured not in distance but in intention. The ground gave slowly. The truth was close, but not yet visible. The excavation resumed just after sunrise, the light thin and colorless beneath a sky that promised rain. The ravine was shallow but steep-sided, its base clogged with wet leaves and silt carried down from higher ground. Investigators worked in silence, removing soil in measured layers, documenting each change in texture and composition. The process was slow by design. No one rushed what could not be undone. Less than 3 feet below the surface, the soil changed abruptly. What lay beneath had been placed deliberately, not buried by chance or erosion. The outline emerged gradually, first indistinct, then unmistakable. The work stopped, and the site was secured. The child was found wrapped in the blanket recovered earlier inside the pumping station. Her clothing matched what had been missing from the house on Willow Bend Road. There were no signs of prolonged restraint, no indication that she had been kept alive for days. The medical findings later established that she had died within hours of being taken, the cause consistent with suffocation. The conclusion was clinical, precise, and devastating in its economy. The pumping station told the rest of the story. It was not a place designed for habitation, but it was hidden, familiar only to those whose work required them to be there. The contractor had keys, codes, and justification for his presence. He could stop without raising suspicion. He could leave without notice. Forensic evidence traced a clear sequence. The van had stopped at the gravel pull-off briefly, long enough for the child to be taken inside. The route east avoided cameras and traffic. The pumping station provided cover. The ravine provided concealment. Each step reflected planning refined over time, not improvisation. Confronted with the evidence, the contractor did not contest the facts. He offered no narrative explanation, no attempt to redirect blame or diminish responsibility. His admissions, delivered without visible emotion, confirmed what the investigation had already established. He had been watching school routes in small towns for years, choosing places where routine created predictability and absence would take time to register. Silver Marsh had not been the first place he observed. It was the first where he acted. Records from previous counties were re-examined in light of his confession. Patterns that had once seemed coincidental aligned. Near misses, reports dismissed as misunderstandings, moments of unease that had never found resolution. The scope of his planning became clearer, though the full extent of his intent remained confined to what could be proven. The case moved quickly after that. Charges were filed. Jurisdictional reviews followed. The family was informed before the news was released publicly. The house on Willow Bend Road was unsealed. The porch light was turned off. There was no prolonged aftermath within the investigation. Once the facts were established, the work ended. Evidence was cataloged. Reports were finalized. The machinery of the legal process took over, impersonal and exacting. In Silver Marsh, the river continued to rise and fall with the season. The footbridge remained in place. Children returned to walking in groups, then eventually alone. The town did not change its shape, only its attention. The morning routine that had been interrupted never fully resumed, but it did move forward. The case closed without ambiguity, not because it offered comfort, but because it left no unanswered question about what had happened between the unlocked door and the road that led out of town.